This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Joey Ayoub. Hello and welcome to the Fire These Times. I'm your host, Joey Ayoub, and this week we have two guests joining us, Leila Al-Shami and Shon Meckfessel. But before introducing them, I'm going to briefly do some basic admin and remind everyone that this podcast and project is independent and ad-free. And to help us kind of keep it that way, I recommend that you go on patreon.com/firethesetimes and you get access to early access, including this episode and all of the others before the public, video exclusive, merchandise, access to the monthly hangout, an upcoming book club, and other fun stuff that we will keep on exploring to do. As I said, like this keeps the Fire These Times independent and ad-free and helps it grow into what I hope eventually will become something more sustainable with more episodes and whatnot. All right, I'm going to introduce both of our guests who are joining us now. Leila Al-Shami is a British Syrian writer and activist and the co-author of the book Burning Country, Syrians in Revolutions and War. She's a returning guest of the Fire These Times, of course. I had her on shortly after the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Russia by Russia of Ukraine last year. I think that was in March 2022 when we did the episode. And I also quickly say that the photo that I'm using for the kind of the preview pic of Leila has been designed by Bisri #6. You can find them on Instagram and on Linktree. I'll post all of that in the show notes. Shon Meckfessel is an American writer and academic and the author of the books Suffolk Howard Gush, A North American Anarchist in the Balkans, and Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be. Now, the reason I'm having both of them on, other than looking at their pretty faces, is that Shon and Leila co-wrote a chapter on the links between white supremacists and the Assad regime, two of my favorite topics. And as part of the book No Pasaran, Anti-Fascist Dispatches for a World in Crisis, edited by Shane Burley, who, of course, was also a recent guest on the podcast. And we talked about the book and a bunch of other stuff. I will also, before start, quickly say that Mariam Elba helped us a lot with research for this podcast. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us, but she's written a number of pieces for The Intercept on the Assad regime, including one in 2017, whose title I'm basically stealing for this podcast, called Why White Nationalists Love Bashar Assad, essentially, which also I will link in the show notes. Okay, that's enough admin stuff. How are you two?
Good. It's nice to be back, Joey.
Doing all right, all things considered.
All things considered. Yeah, I mean, we're recording this on February 9th. So there was obviously the horrific earthquake that largely hit Turkey and Syria a few days ago. The aftermaths are still very, very much present. And it is quite horrible. I'm putting, by the time this goes out, I won't put the links, but I will include donation links and whatnot in the episode that comes out tomorrow by the time this is recorded, which is very confusing because by the time people listen, it will not be tomorrow anymore. But what can I say? This is technology. Okay. Leila and Shon, can you walk us through a bit, kind of an overview of this chapter and why you sort of got into it? Why did you write this book and how did it come to be included in, it's part of the international section of that book, No Pasaran. So what is sort of the relevance between the theme of that book, let's put it that way, and the topic of the book more broadly, and just sort of talk to us about the book, if that's okay, and the chapter.
Well, it's funny reading through the book. I was really excited to finally see it come out, and I was really impressed that Shane Burley kind of found so many of my favorite voices through so many different scenes and specializations and brought them together. I was kind of like, oh, I didn't know Shane knew all these people too. And one of the funny things is, and it took quite a while. It's a book of some scope, but it was funny. Like nearly every chapter has at some point mentions something about the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, August 12th, 2017. And so that's also how ours begins. So that seems like, definitely a through line where this moment really hit the United States, realizing that we were up against a new political formation that many people didn't see coming. I think a lot of us, who have been following the developments of the far right have seen it coming for a long time. But the aspects of it that we focused on is James Alex Fields Jr., he was the member of Vanguard America who ran his car into a group of protesters, killing Heather Heyer and critically injuring a number of other anti-fascist protesters in that rally. A lot of journalists, again, who didn't see this coming, they sort of flocked to get what information they could about him, and they saw on his Facebook page that his latest post was a picture of Bashar al-Assad with the word "undefeated" underneath it. And I think a lot of people, we saw sort of a general public reaction, which is like, wait, what? Like it didn't gel with a lot of the sort of mainstream understandings of what is behind far right activists. Bashar al-Assad is, he's Alawi, but that's essentially Muslim. He's an Arab, and a lot of doesn't immediately fit the notions of the heroic figures for far right racists. So I think that was kind of the launching point for our chapter, was to kind of propose an answer to that, how this fits in and how it actually is quite consistent in ways, and it shows us a lot about the constitution, the composition of the far right, that I would say sort of belies the traditional liberal notion that the racists and fascists are just woefully ignorant and insufficiently cosmopolitan. What we kind of get into is that fascism has its own cosmopolitanism that we need to attend to if we're ever going to stop it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Leila?
Yeah, I think my interest in this topic, I first started looking at the far right support for Assad in 2013. I wrote an article focusing mainly on European fascist movements, and we'd seen during that period quite a lot of solidarity delegations going from Europe, from European fascist parties to Syria. So I was very interested, like, what was the reason for that? Why was the far right in Europe identifying so much with an Arab Syrian dictator? And I think also because in that period or shortly before, what we see across the Western world is a real resurgence in the far right. It starts gaining more and more power, more and more influence. You had things, the alt-right was very big in the US at that time. A lot of that energy brought together Donald Trump. You also had Brexit in the UK. Obviously, Brexit's not a fascist movement, but I think these things were very influenced in many ways by Syria and by the Syrian refugee crisis, or that gave a lot of far-right movements or a lot of more nationalist tendencies in Europe a lot of impetus to mobilise. So I was quite interested in that, what the connections were between Syria and this kind of far-right revival.
Mm. It's kind of this curious thing, because in some sense, like the three of us met around this. I can only describe it as at the start, at the very least, a kind of a disbelief, and then a growing anger at what was happening, not just obviously in Syria proper, which is an entire level of anger in itself, but we're seeing, especially on social media, obviously on Facebook and growingly on Twitter at one point, that this would have been 2014, 2015, 2016 especially, and then it just grew more and more after that. Figures that we would associate with like tankies or the quote-unquote far left, saying stuff about Assad that falls into the usual quote-unquote anti-imperialism, which I've discussed ad nauseum on this podcast, but also the majority of Assad support coming from the far right. And so it was this very kind of confusing thing at first, at least for me, seeing, the delegate, you mentioned the delegations going to Syria. Like my estimates, I had written a piece about it, like something like 80% of them were on the far right, and around 20% of them were quote unquote on the far left. These included at the time, the vice president nominee for the Green Party, and a number of other figures on the far left in Spain. I had written a piece with our friend Leila Rego for, I'm gonna say, El Diario, although I don't remember at this point, on that topic. And of course in France, and the figure of Mélenchon, we've had some comments, and obviously in the UK in the figure of Corbyn, and even more notably people around Corbyn, I think it's fair to say, and and so on and so forth. So at the same time as kind of this was happening, it was very, for me anyway, disorienting at first, and then, as I said, very infuriating, to see the obvious connections between the far right and Bashar al-Assad kind of being denied by large swaths of the left. This is what prompted Mariam Elba, for that matter, to write that piece for The Intercept, of course, Why White Nationalists Love Bashar al-Assad, a response in many ways to that growing understanding among, people who research the far right, anarchists, anti-fascists, and others, scholars, activists alike, and whatnot, who have been seeing this kind of grow more and more. Because one thing that I would say we tend to do more often than many other folks is take them seriously and take what they actually say seriously. It's that whole when someone tells you who they are, believe them. Talk to us a bit more, if that's okay, as a way of sort of anchoring this conversation. How have you seen this phenomenon evolve over the years? And yeah, even chronologically, if you want, however you feel most comfortable.
I think that we saw this wave of we saw visible support from a lot of far right parties in Europe, such as the National Front, Casa Pound, Falange from Poland, the British National Party, putting out statements in support of the Assad regime and going on fact-finding missions to Syria, to Damascus, where they would report, that everything in central Damascus is fine, there aren't any problems there. I think this narrative has developed more over time with the refugee crisis, because what far-right groups are trying to do is say that Syria is safe for refugees to return to, and there's no reason why refugees should stay in Europe. And you have different groups that are very much involved in promoting that narrative. There's a French NGO, Christians of the Orient, I think the translation is, which has very strong far-right connections, which it actually works with refugees in Lebanon, and it's been sending delegations to Syria. Also, you might have seen these travel vloggers that are going to Syria and saying everything's safe in Syria. Now, when I watched a couple of those videos, what I saw was that they were actually being hosted by this Christians of the Orient. They were the people that were taking them round. So I think a part of this feeling now is that they want to promote that narrative that Syria is safe, that the war is over, and that refugees no longer need to stay in Western countries. We will talk more, I'm sure, through this hour about why the far right identified with the regime as a fascist regime as well.
I think I'm kind of thinking about two developments that have really come into relief, come into, more clear outline since we all have kind of come to be friends and got to know each other and been working on this stuff. One is that a lot of those agents really are directly state sponsored. And I mean, it's not my specialization, so I don't have the links, but I know we've talked about this a fair bit. People like Ben Norton and Max Blumenfeld, certainly have taken a paycheck, or Mint Press News. I mean, it's not a coincidence that they tend to be doing really quite well, and those of us working, on the critical power side tend to still have to have day jobs. So I think I think some of those numbers have come to light. We've seen a number of exposés about the direct state-sponsored ties with that, let alone access to state resources such as RT and whatever innumerable Russian-sponsored and to a lesser extent Chinese state-sponsored media outlets and other kind of discursive resources. So that has, and also the sort of troll factories factor, which I think a lot of us suspected, interacting with people online and getting kind of just piled on with people a lot of the time using the same lines. A lot of the research has come out showing that we were not just only dealing with well-intentioned, naive people coming from a good place, that we were often dealing with people who were paid to create that noise, and that's part of the model. It's interesting, I would say, the Ukraine situation, the Russia's war in Ukraine, which began just about a month ago, has, in its intense phase, has kind of highlighted that, because a lot of Russian state resources are getting rediverted to that, and we're actually seeing a lot less of the opposition that we had kind of grown used to over the last roughly 8 years, because these things that we suspected were coming from state-sponsored resources really were, and as those resources are getting diverted, suddenly the noise is going away a little bit. So, and I think another thing that I think we've sort of worked out in our conversations, and I think other scholars have kind of, and activists have kind of made more sense of, and has kind of appeared more on time, particularly with the role of the left in this, is that we're in a changing world, and to some degree, even if the United States has still over half of the military power in the world, over half of the military spending of the world at any given time, and still has, obviously hundreds of bases around the world, and to be clear, is still enacting in colonial projects. Like New York Times this week had an article about how the U.S. is, bolstering its presence in the Philippines in view of pushing back against Chinese power. At the same time, this is in a larger context where of the sort of post Cold War, and also post Cold War context where U.S. empire is particularly as the effects from the 2003 war on Iraq really come home, and the country is reeling from some of the economic effects. One would like to think some of the moral effects probably less so. Things were sort of changing, and you still have this historical formation, these institutions, these identities, these social networks, and people's social capital tied up in this opposition to Western imperialism, kind of not quite sure what to do with itself. I'm really interested in this, and I'm not sure I've found people really unpack this, but I think sort of initially, particularly in the Syria conflict in the maybe 2015, 2016, as Russia was amping up its involvement, I think it sort of happened on these happy coincidences of alliance with that sort of social momentum of internal opposition to U.S. dominance, and then it sort of focused its approach and started sponsoring it more directly over time. Things like, for example, the language of the European New Right. Leila was talking about the kind of institutional priorities and the way that those have informed these things. Also, I sort of come at things from like a discourse perspective. The way that the European far right has presented this way to say things like LGBTQ, queer rights, things like claims for human rights, things like claims for gender diversity and anti-racism, essentially egalitarian claims. The European New Right and Alexander Dugin in Russia have articulated this whole discourse about those as sort of these like Western cultural imperialist impositions. And even though one would think that Western leftists would want to protect egalitarian claims, because I think that's what the left means historically, a lot of the sort of social institutions, identities tied up with opposing the West in this time of crisis where it's not quite sure like what to do with itself, actually finds a way to sort of sees itself in those European New Right Duginist claims as a way to at least still be standing up against Western imperialism, and continuing its to be doing what it's doing, even if obviously one would hope that people would see these contradictions with what's actually being said. So I think those things were all, again, like sort of 8 years ago when we started talking actively about this, we kind of had a hunch, but I think those things have come into starker relief as the research has come out and as people have sort of outed themselves more directly where they're at in developments.
Yeah, that's one of the main things I do remember about that time. And here I'm referring again, like 2014, 2015 or so, was a lot of this belief, not just about like from my side, but when we or myself and others would kind of point out that these things are happening, that there is this growing link between the far right and Bashar al-Assad, a lot of very otherwise reasonable folks kind of interpreted all of this as kind of like either conspiracy theories or me being quote unquote biased because I'm obviously against Bashar al-Assad, kind of seeing things that are not there, even when you directly just show a photo of a fascist or a white nationalist or whatever, especially in the US, but also in Europe, with a photo of Bashar al-Assad, or, with even a flag of Hezbollah, as Matthew Heinberg at some point pictured himself next to a flag of Hezbollah and a flag of Russia. And, and the point I was obviously trying to make is not that, everyone necessarily thinks that way, is that this thing existed, and there were lots of indications that it was growing. And as anti-fascists and anti-authoritarians and whatnot are supposedly one of the main things that we do is understand our enemy, and we need to understand why that is the case. And in many ways, this kind of like invisibilization of Syria and the discourse related to anti-fascism, to fascism and to anti-fascism, I think has been part of the problem in the same ways as genocide denialism when it comes to Bosnia, for example, or Rwanda or Cambodia or what have you, is also part of what gets recycled today. I mean, we see this on the far right, especially when it comes to Bosnia, obviously, being echoed in their apology of Vladimir Putin and or of Bashar al-Assad. They make those links. They have always made those links. They make the links between supporting Serbian ultranationalism and supporting Vladimir Putin, and or supporting Bashar al-Assad, and etc., etc. And then some of them will have these internally coherent but externally, like, it looks definitely bizarre. Like, some of them will love Bashar al-Assad, and some of them will say, well, no, he's just some Arab in the desert, and they don't like him. And I think a big part of the problem at the time, and this has only grown since, to be honest, is this idea that if something doesn't make sense, as in it's not logical, then it can't quite be that way. And we can think of, even like to this day, the fact that you have someone like Kanye West, aka Ye, who's saying stuff about Jewish people and saying that he likes Hitler and shit like that, and lots of folk being very confused because, like, well, this guy is a black man. Why could you say stuff like that? But it doesn't have to make sense, quote unquote, for it to be something worth noting and worth paying attention to and obviously opposing. And the same happens with the far right. Some of them are, for example, pro-Israel. Some of them are anti-Israel. Those who are anti-Israel, usually it's because they're anti-Semitic, not because they're anti-Zionist. Some of them will say that they're anti-Zionist, but it's kind of just an expansion of their anti-Semitism. And one being anti-Zionist does not mean that we should then confuse that with supporting those people. So just to say, like, all of these things exist at the same time. The far right is not a unified movement, thank goodness, but it's part of the danger is when it becomes more and more unified. Obviously, when they do have those transnational links, as we saw with stuff like Identity Europa or the Proud Boys doing whatever the fuck they were doing in Canada, and stuff like that. These links that they are trying to build, obviously, the best way to oppose them is to understand what is it about those links that unites them. Obviously, referencing Unite the Right rally, it was literally in the title in Charlottesville, I believe. And yeah, so the link with Syria is something that I wanted us obviously to focus on. I don't want to focus too much on the far right in the US and internal stuff or what have you. Done other episodes on that, but specifically the link to Syria and why does it even, why do they give a shit, like, to just put it that way? With Syria being kind of rendered invisible, I think has made anti-fascist responses weaker. And I think it's made a normalization of Bashar al-Assad essentially being kind of a de facto kind of hegemonic reality, which I think we see to this day. As I said, as we're recording this shortly after the earthquake in Syria, and we saw, an outlet like Progressive International and a bunch of other people on the left saying that, the main thing that is preventing reconstruction in Syria and helping in Syria and whatnot is the sanctions on Syria. And while the sanctions should be part of a nuanced and pretty complicated conversation, it's obviously not that straightforward, especially because the vast majority of the places that are now ruined long before the earthquake have been destroyed by Bashar al-Assad. And I don't know if this needs to be really said, but I guess I'll say it. But it's much more difficult to survive an earthquake if your building was already bombed by a barrel bomb or by the Russians or by what have you beforehand, which is actually the case of many folks in Aleppo, for example, right? So what do you make of the we spoke a bit about the link to Syria, but feel free to bring it up again to explore it again, but of the invisibilization, as I'm calling it, of Syria in discourses around anti-fascists for the most part, not really talking about it, with the notable exception of when it's about Rojava and the Turkish government, which should also be opposed. Of course, the Turkish government should be opposed. But with that notable exception, which has like an interesting dynamics in itself, which is, I think, beyond our topic of conversation, why has Syria been invisibilized in your view, and what are the
Well,
consequences of that?
there's a lot there. So I can't. And I think in a way, it also opened up the central question of the chapter. So we'll probably want to kind of come back to different aspects of it. But I just want to start with one. I mean, one question that you had at the heart of this is sort of like what attracts people to analogies and to other issues around the world, including our enemies. And I think I just want to. This is my academic hat just for a second. There's sort of a cultural studies. You were talking about the sort of contradictions that are often seen with the far right liking Arabs and Muslims and taking them as somebody to copy, whereas somebody else in the movement might be like, wait, those are not the people we like. From a kind of cultural studies framing, from a kind of cultural studies base of analysis, it's more about what do the discourses sort of do for people. So a lot of the time it's like, working class people, like working class white people in the United States cheering on police and having like a Blue Lives Matter sticker on their car. It's like those people are actually getting killed by police too. It's a lower rate than black people or BIPOC people in general, but at the same time, like the United States, even white people get killed at significantly higher rates by police than in most other industrialized countries. So why would they have it? And the answer is it's the active identification with power that they're sort of latching onto. So I think that's one way to answer these questions. And so, some of our chapter gets into this sort of, I think, for example, the open genocidal policies against their own population of the Assad regime is something enviable to people on the far right. It's like a naked, unapologetic exercise of the starkest egalitarian politics you could ever have. It's not beholden to any sort of, moral compass or whatever. In some way, I write about in the chapter is like an absolute freedom of the state. And so people whose politics come from this kind of identification with the state, that's like the highest form of freedom that they can imagine is a state genocide against its own people, completely unrestrained. And of course, the Assad regime has like excelled at that practice. I think, though, it's also important to not just stick with that because that can kind of bolster that liberal traditional, the cliched liberal view of the sort of ignorance and like, oh, they're so stupid they don't even see their own contradictions of the far right. A lot of it is very consistent and rational. I think, part of the chapter we get into the history of Mussolini's foreign minister Corradini, and he came up with a theory of proletarian nations versus bourgeois nations. And it's not that that theory doesn't make sense. I mean, it's completely consistent as a political philosophy. It's one that essentially, in the end, justifies inequality within those societies, but it's not stupid. and and we see, I mean, it reminds me, I at one point when I was in Beirut was interviewing a wonderful group called Socialist Forum, and they sort of said, like, why is it that in places like Syria and places like Lebanon, we don't get to have class struggle? The only conflicts, the only struggle we're allowed to participate in is the anti-imperialist ones, judged from the sort of risk board view of their countries, which is to say, from the state level. And they're like, why is it that all these, even like many alleged Marxists don't allow us to have class struggle, even if places like the UK and US and Germany get to fight against their bosses? Why do we have to follow our bosses if our bosses, just because our bosses are allegedly in an axis of resistance? So I just want to emphasize, I mean, that is a politics. It's consistent. It's rational. It's evil, I think, right? And it's starkly inegalitarian, but it's not. It's not dumb, and it's not really contradictory. I think it's consistent. And I wanted to pass to Leila too. I think in terms of particularly Syrian history, it comes from a long tradition.
Mm. Yeah, I think that definitely the far right sees in the Ba'ath Party, which is the ruling party in Syria, a historical continuity with National Socialism or with fascist movements of the 20th century, because it shares characteristics with those movements. You have the authoritarianism of the Syrian regime and the cult of personality around the president, which is very strong and very reminiscent of totalitarian regimes, not only fascist regimes of the 20th century, but also communist regimes. And when the Arab Socialist Ba'ath came to power in 1963, it came to power on a platform which combined Arab nationalism and Arab socialism, both of which were witnessing a large resurgence in the wave of decolonization. And the Ba'ath advocated for the unification of the Arab countries into one Arab state, led by a Ba'ath revolutionary vanguard. If you actually look at the 1973 constitution, it says that the Ba'ath Party is the leading party in society and state. And the Ba'ath really, it kind of mythologized the idea of the Arab nation. It was like a very romantic vision of past glories, which I think was a way to counter the humiliations that the Arab world had suffered under French and British colonization. And it was a very secular party, so it really attracted a lot of minority groups to support the Ba'ath. And it advocated socialist economics, but rejected the Marxist conception of class struggle. As Shon said, the Ba'ath saw, going back to this idea of the Italian fascists, the Ba'ath saw that all the classes amongst the Arabs were kind of united in opposing colonial domination by imperial powers, so that nations, rather than social groups within nations, were the primary site of struggle. And I think that's interesting, because I think you see that idea coming in more and more into the left, when you see more and more people on the left advocating for multipolarity. You see those ideas. It was very top-down kind of socialist economic planning based on the Soviet model, through nationalizing major industries, doing large infrastructure development, and redistributing land away from the landowning class. So there were these populist policies which really won the Ba'ath Party kind of cross-sect peasant support, which obviously it lost later on when Hafiz al-Assad, and particularly his son Bashar, started implementing the neoliberal economic policies, which once again kind of shifted the economic balance and dynamics. And Assad came to power through an internal coup within the Ba'ath Party, which was a purge of the left-wing faction of the Ba'ath Party, and either got rid of or co-opted the left. Some parts of the left joined kind of the ruling coalition. The ones that wanted to remain independent were kind of wiped out. And it also got rid of all kind of free unions and independent associations, and started setting up these parastatal organisations which were said to represent the interests of workers, of students, etc. And there was this indoctrination of the population through these Ba'ath-controlled organisations around the Ba'ath, around the Arab nations. So, for example, in schools, you had two Ba'ath parties. You had the Ba'ath vanguards, which all primary school children had to join, and you had the Revolutionary Youth Union, which all secondary school children had to join. So that was very much a vehicle for kind of promoting Ba'athist ideology and promoting Arab nationalism. And with Hafiz al-Assad, he really built this totalitarian police state, as you know, where there was tripartite control of the state by the Ba'ath Party, the security apparatus, and the military. But in reality, the power was very much centralized in the presidency, centralized in Hafiz al-Assad, and there was this big cult of personality around the president, and, you know, people were made to attend kind of these choreographed spectacles of like adoration for the president. There were pictures of the president everywhere in Syria. You still see those today with Bashar. So I think there's a lot of factors which are reminiscent of fascist movements of the 20th century that the far right identifies with. And the far right interest in Syria goes back in 2005. You had a visit actually to Damascus by David Duke. And he gave a speech on Syrian state television. He said, you know, we really identify with Syria because our country in the US is occupied by Zionists in the same way that your country in the Jolan, in the Golan Heights, is also occupied by Zionists. So there is some affinity between the far right in terms of the regime represents something that the far right clearly identifies with.
Mm-hmm. And David Duke being obviously one of the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan in the US at the time. Um, This kind of brings me. So, a couple of thoughts. The second one is going to be on the politics of respectability, which I want us to get into a bit more. But the first one, you mentioned how a core ideology of kind of the right wing faction of the Ba'ath Party, which is the one obviously that won out after 1970, after the internal coup, as you mentioned, by Hafiz Assad and his allies. Um, that kind of logic of a hollowed out leftism, I'm not entirely sure what to call it. As I said, like I did a recent interview with on multipolar imperialism with Kavita Krishnan, with Promise Lee, and with Romeo Kochiatsky. And Kavita Krishnan especially is kind of most relevant to our conversation because she was part of one of the main communist parties of India. She was on the Politburo for like over 20 years or something. And she resigned late last year, so a few months ago, over the question of Ukraine. Now, what I found very interesting about these kind of dynamics is kind of the same reason why, for example, a community like Syrian Palestinians, especially around Yarmouk, are sort of kind of ignored or erased in discourses that are, the quote unquote anti imperialist discourses because they don't quite fit the narrative of being both against Israel, because obviously they are Palestinian refugees from the time of the Nakba or slightly after, and also being anti Assad regime as being part of the areas of Syria that rose up in 2011. And those contradictions, or the seeming contradictions, become contradictions in the minds, I think, of people who adopt the simplistic anti-imperialist worldview. But this can only be possible if they have no analysis of class, if they have no analysis of power, of the state for that matter, of all of that stuff. If indeed they basically adopt the Ba'athist, if you want to put it that way, version of like quote unquote leftism, of some kind of socialism, but kind of hollowed out by any kind of class struggle that are supposed to be like, I'm not a class determinist, but class is one of the factors to take into consideration, obviously. I find that very interesting because, and obviously very distressing, because in some sense, that's kind of the rule book that was played against us, like in the Middle East. Well, you mentioned 1970, obviously, but especially after 1979, after the Iranian Revolution, which obviously brought to power the Ayatollah at the time, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was then succeeded by Khamenei, who is still the Ayatollah today. That version of sort of a very vague populism that's sort of left-ish, but doesn't have any kind of class analysis, doesn't have any kind of actual social justice, let's put it that way. And also at the same time, always targeting first, or most of the time targeting first, internal threats, which more often than not were the local left. So in Iran, obviously that included the persecution of Iranian communists and other Iranian leftists, which continued even during the Iran-Iraq war. And in Lebanon, for example, when Hezbollah was kind of gaining grounds, they started by assassinating very known Lebanese Marxists and communists in the south who were themselves Shia, because they saw them as the primary opponent. So they literally played out the Iranian rule book in Lebanon. And I find it very depressing, to be honest, that you can have literal Syrian communists today, like Yassin Haj Saleh, who's obviously a friend of ours and who's going to be on this podcast soon. Him and his wife Samir Al Khalil, both of them participating in like communist related actions in Syria, and both of them in prison for that reason, for an extended period of time. They're not part of these, like they're not invited in those great halls of left-wing organizing in the US. The groups that tend to have more resources, at least are trying to organize to have more resources, and are proposing this supposedly alternative vision of the world that's more just and whatnot, and yet at the same time reifying the same kind of authoritarian logic, essentially, that they say they oppose at home, but somehow find no problems supporting it abroad. Anyway, all of this long thing to kind of also segue to this idea of respectability politics, because it's one thing to, of course, oppose the far right that's doing so, and even criticize the far left when it does so, and so on. But this kind of respectability politics around, especially Bashar al-Assad, more so than Hafiz al-Assad, because Bashar took over obviously in 2000 when Hafiz died. Bashar was, close to a lot of Western powers in the same way as, Gaddafi was close to Berlusconi at the time and stuff like that. And he very much played on this idea that he's, the strong man, but who's kind of a bit more tolerant, and especially in the early years, early 2000, who obviously is secular, who is the one that's keeping at bay the groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and that sort of thing. And here I'm thinking that, and this is one of the aspects of the research that Mariam helped us remember, that in 2011, in February 2011, just before the revolution really kicked off in Syria, there was obviously this, I think now notorious profile of Asma al-Assad on Vogue, and with sentences that I'm actually going to quote, and the title was "A Rose in the Desert." And I'm going to mention some of them just to kind of obviously make the point that we're trying to make. So I don't know who the author was, but she's described as Asma al-Assad is glamorous, young, and very chic, the freshest and most magnetic of first ladies. Her style is not the couture and bling dazzle of Middle Eastern power, but a deliberate lack of adornment. She's a rare combination, a thin, long-limbed beauty with a trained, analytic mind who dresses with cunning understatement. Paris Match calls her the element of light in a country full of shadow zones. So here you have Vogue on the one hand,
No, sorry, no racial connotations there at all.
none whatsoever. So like you have on the one hand, of course, Vogue itself, but Vogue is then also quoting Paris Match, which Bashar al-Assad obviously has selfies with Sarkozy and other European leaders, and this was always like the part, like, oh well, he speaks English pretty well, his wife is British educated, they're sort of very sophisticated, and this
He's a doctor.
he's a doctor, and that's quite literally what you mentioned. David Duke himself, like I think 2 or 3 times on Twitter before he was permanently banned, was like praising the family of Bashar al-Assad as the first lady, and at the time during the Obama presidency, especially contrasting how quote unquote white they looked in comparison, obviously, to Barack and Michelle Obama. And so this was kind of, David Duke, to be honest, not paid attention to as much, but those early signs were then picked up when the so-called alt-right, after Steve Bannon and all of that shit, became more and more hegemonic, and obviously catapulted when Donald Trump became president of the US at the time. So can you kind of at least comment on this idea of respectability politics and how it intersects with what we are talking about here in relation to Bashar al-Assad having this quote unquote respectability aura around him, and how it's still in many ways still working and has been working since he took power?
Well, there's a lot there, and maybe I think we should go back to Yarmouk in a minute, but
Yes.
which is a bit separate topic than respectability politics. But I think I mean, I think you've said a lot of it. I think Yassine Haj Saleh said it best when it's sort of like there's a very smart public relations move to on the Syrian regime's very conscious part to contrast what Yassine calls fascists with ties to fascists with beards, and by highlighting, for example, Daesh or ISIS, and as Leila's written about extensively, by the intentional campaign to release some of the more extremist Islamicist fighters from previous waves, releasing them from prisons while secular or multi-ethnic activists were being tortured to death. There was consciously a strategy to appeal to those sort of respectability politics by contrasting them with openly racist tropes about more traditionalist, mujahideen. I think it's also potentially helpful to kind of go back. We're using this term respectability politics, and I always think it's helpful to see the way that terms and discursive, concepts can kind of travel. And this is a hot term right now because it actually is from the left, and particularly Black Lives Matter. I would say really beginning 2014, 2015, with a sort of generational struggle within Black politics in the US, turning against a lot of the commonplaces from the civil rights movement, particularly, things often falsely and unfairly attributed to Martin Luther King, but some things truly so. For example, Rosa Parks. I wrote about this in my book on nonviolence. Rosa Parks was chosen as a conscious figure because she had sort of a clean record, and she was the third Black woman in the town of the bus boycotts to do this, but the first one was like a pregnant teenager, and the second had like an alcoholic father, and so they were worried that they weren't going to be sufficiently presentable. And the problem with relying, and so and again, like the lunch counter sit-ins to a lesser degree, and a lot of the figures of the civil rights movement were college kids, were Black middle class people, were well educated, and there was a move to sort of distance the issues from the majority of people that were impacted from it, because I think the strategy was that it would present an easier image for white people to accept. The problem, of course, is in the intervening years, like I teach in my classes the film 13th, which I think is the best single source for this whole story and has a lot of wonderful scholars in it. The problem is, as those Jim Crow laws and legal apartheid systems in the United States transitioned to police discretion and DA discretion and the war on drugs and a lot of racialized but not openly racialized practices rather than openly racial legal language. Respectability politics kind of came to reproduce a lot of that oppression because it ends up sort of there's a hip hop song that says "You put the shame on us." It ends up sort of accepting rather than rejecting the shame that was put on black youth and black working class people and the underclass by sort of trying to only show the sort of the Bill Cosby pull up your pants phenomenon. Ends up what things that came from a previous wave of anti-racist struggle end up being very useful tools to reproduce racism in the new one. So I think it's interesting to think that that's actually quite recent history of this term respectability politics. Was that we have to, it's only said in a critical sense. As far as I know, nobody says like, I believe in respectability politics. It's always like a term meaning that you're sort of reproducing your enemy's stereotypes in the way that you're trying to like fight them or whatever, or wage larger battle. And so I think in terms of the right, what we're really talking about is making things that have been unspeakable permitted within the public discourse. And so, I think, for example, Leila wrote a great portion of our chapter about the role of conspiracy theory. And I remember when I was in Syria, I lived in Yarmouk for some months before the revolution, the war, and it struck me in Syria at the time that the ruling ideology was conspiracism. And I think it's interesting to see conspiracism in Syria. I think, like Ryszard Kapuscinski on his book on Iran after the overthrow of the Shah, it has a really beautiful interview with this guy who is going, in his explanation of phenomena, he's going so out of his way to not say these concrete things that are like right in front of his face. And that's because under the Shah and under Bashar al-Assad now, it's like it's extremely dangerous to speak openly about these things that are very obviously making your life bad. But you have to say something. And so conspiracism in that context fulfilled this role of being able to kind of articulate your emotions and put them into words and communicate them to others, even if the vehicle for that is obviously kind of silly. It's like Israel didn't make your coffee cold this morning. It was just that like you can't actually say the things that are making your life miserable, and so you have to find another way to say them. I think that's why conspiracy theories were the ruling ideology in Syria when I was there before the revolution. I think in the U.S. it comes back to when we talk about respectability politics. That's another side of the same function as conspiracism. What the far right is doing is sort of Trojan horsing into discourse things like maybe certain people are biologically inferior, maybe certain people the world would be better off if we just exterminated them. Those are not okay ideas after particularly the Holocaust. But if you kind of displace them into this faraway place that people don't know that much about, and if you justify them by saying, well, really, he's fighting Islamic terror just like we are or whatever, it suddenly kind of makes those things sayable. And now we've seen that, the right, I think, can claim a victory in, as they say, shifting the Overton window to the right. It's really the things that people like are sayable on even, mainstream, like relatively mainstream outlets like Fox News or something, there's a lot of things that are sayable now in a very anti-humanist, very starkly inegalitarian way that were not polite things to say a decade ago.
I think that a lot of the appeal of Assad is not only on the right but also on the left, is that he's seen as a secular leader. And this is so much linked into Islamophobia and war on terror discourse, where terrorism is totally equated in the popular imaginary with Islamism. And what we've seen is that people will accept completely unrestrained violence of the state in cracking down and exterminating the Islamist threat. And Assad was very clever in how he used that. He really took steps which facilitated the Islamization of the opposition. Many key figures in some of the most hardline Islamist groups were actually imprisoned by the regime in 2011 and were then released and went on to form some of these hardline military battalions that emerged, particularly after 2013, 2014. And Assad knew that by creating and facilitating this spectre of Islamist extremism, that he would get support from two constituencies. One was an internal constituency. He knew that that would frighten minority groups within Syria into support. They might not have liked Assad, but they may have feared what was portrayed as the alternative to Assad even more. And the second thing was to create international support for his campaign of extermination, which is what the UN called Assad's waging war against the democratic opposition. It was a policy of extermination. So, he really knew that people would stand beside him if he was seen as the secular leader combating an Islamist threat. And as Shon mentioned, Yassine said, that there's the fascists with the neckties and the fascists with the beards, and people are going to turn a blind eye to the fascists with the neckties if they're seen to be combating the bearded variety, which is always seen as a greater threat. So he played on that. He knew how to portray his desire for power to an external and an internal audience, and it worked. And we see, even many times I see on social media, people on the left who claim to be on the left, they will say, look at Damascus. In Damascus, there's women out in nightclubs. In Latakia, there's women on the beaches wearing bikinis. But if you look at the opposition areas, all of the women are covered. And, so all these Islamophobic tropes are being brought into play in service of preserving the regime or supporting the regime.
Hey everyone, Joey here. Unfortunately, we had some technical issues while recording this, and it seems that the last 10 minutes or so of our recording just disappeared. No idea why. It took me like a couple of days of looking into it and seeing if there was a way to fix it, and maybe the files were recorded in a different place and whatnot, but sometimes technology just fails us, and gotta accept it, I guess. It's a bit of a bummer because I really like the way we actually ended. So I'll briefly say that the tone was optimistic. I cannot recall it from memory because my memory sucks sometimes. So it is what it is. This is an awkward ending. I'm gonna just thank you all for listening thus far. And I will, the usual stuff. Thank you for listening. Join us on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes if you want. Share it with your friends and family, and I hope that you got something out of this conversation, regardless of how it unfortunately ended, or technically it did not end. So yeah, again, thanks for listening, and here's the outro music. The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.